Court records from Wilkinson County, Georgia, once contained an account of 5 plantation overseers who ventured into the Ojai River bottomlands on October 14, 1839. Only a single man returned, half-mad and incoherent, unable to articulate a single clear thought for nearly a month. Authorities dismissed the other 4 as casualties of the swamp's natural dangers, yet witnesses maintained that the survivors' limbs were marked with intentional, disturbing scratches arranged in precise configurations. He spent his days kneeling in the dust outside the county jail, his fingers tracing the same enigmatic symbol over and over again. Local Creek elders spoke in hushed tones, suggesting the mark represented a total reversal of destiny, a sign that the hunter had become the prey. For more than a century following the event, the descendants of those overseers maintained a wall of silence regarding that day, the woods, or the young girl who guided their ancestors into a wilderness from which they never emerged. Most troubling of all, the official incident report vanished from the county archives 8 years after the catastrophe, as if a deliberate hand sought to erase the truth before the wrong questions were asked. However, fragmented testimonies scattered throughout, neglected estate ledgers, and misplaced depositions reconstruct a narrative far more harrowing than a simple accident. It is a story designed to haunt those who believe that physical power, weaponry, and superior numbers are a shield against the unknown. What transpired in those murky bottomlands was not a pursuit but a masterclass in humility. An introduction to a world where an intimate connection to the earth mattered more than a rifle, and where a 15-year-old girl, whom the white men viewed as mere property, possessed every advantage they lacked. Before we delve into the details of what occurred in those Georgia wetlands, remember that if accounts of hidden histories and dark tragedies captivate you, please subscribe and enable notifications. I am also curious to know where you are joining us from. Share your location in the comments. Now let us venture into the depths where 5 armed men discovered too late that they were the subjects of a study, not the masters of the hunt. In 1839, Wilkinson County existed as a peculiar corner of Georgia, situated between aggressive plantations and creek territories scarred by the legacy of forced removal. Too isolated for wealthy aristocrats and too precarious for timid investors, it served as a sanctuary for desperate farmers, men who had failed elsewhere and hoped the rugged land might cancel their failures. The Ojai bottomlands on the eastern edge were infamous long before the indigenous tribes were pushed west. Constant flooding reshaped the river, erasing solid paths and carving new channels in a single night. The cypress growth was so thick that sunlight rarely reached the forest floor, and the stench of damp moss and rot saturated the air. Travelers claimed the swamp swallowed sound, deadened gunfire, and shattered any sense of direction, a labyrinth where people disappeared without leaving a trace. Adjoining this wilderness was the Gresham Plantation, 400 acres of struggling cotton tended by 37 enslaved individuals and governed by a man who was utterly unfit for his position. Thomas Gresham had fled to Georgia after losing his fortune in South Carolina, relying on high-interest loans to buy land that no seasoned planter would touch. By 1839, he was teetering on financial ruin. His soil was spent, his harvests were failing, and his labor force was nearing open rebellion. He attempted to compensate by employing 5 overseers, a ridiculous number for such a modest operation. However, Gresham believed that raw violence could fix what his intellect could not. These overseers were outcasts, dismissed from even the harshest plantations for a brand of brutality that disturbed even those accustomed to systemic cruelty. Leading them was Jacob Yarrow, a man who recorded lashes and punishments with the clinical coldness of an accountant, calculating precisely how much agony a human could sustain before the spirit broke. His brother Samuel mirrored this malice, while the other 3, Nathaniel Cruz, William Tyson, and Henry Burke, were drawn to the role because it offered a space where their most sadistic impulses were unchecked. Among those trapped under Gresham's thumb was Celia, a 15-year-old girl who was quiet, observant, and far more formidable than anyone suspected. Her mother had been a Creek woman captured during the years of conflict, and her father was an African man brought into the country through the illicit trade. From her mother, Celia inherited an intimate knowledge of the wild, how to move in total silence, how to navigate flooded earth, and how to interpret the wind, birds, and mud as if they were pages in a book. From her father, she gained the skill to create tools from discarded scraps. Working in the garden near the main house, she mostly avoided the field overseers, yet she could not escape the gaze of men who saw her youth as an invitation. She sensed the approaching shadow of danger long before it arrived. She learned to move like vapor, to vanish in plain sight, and to establish supply caches within the bottomlands that only she could find. When the morning came that Samuel Yarrow ordered her to the overseer's cabin, Celia knew the time for hiding had ended. She would not be coming back. She did not flee immediately. Running too soon would betray terror, and terror was the fuel the Yarrows craved. Instead, when Samuel barked his order, she walked with a steady, deliberate pace, as if to comply. But when she reached the threshold of the cabin, she simply kept moving. Her stride did not falter as she headed toward the eastern boundary where the forest waited to receive her. Samuel's shout shattered the morning quiet, followed by the heavy rhythm of boots and the rising excitement of men who enjoyed the hunt. Celia did not look back. Only upon reaching the tree line did she accelerate, vanishing into the deep green like a shadow returning to its source. Behind her, the overseers scrambled, seizing ropes and weapons. They were so eager to assert their dominance that they failed to realize they had surrendered their power the moment they crossed into the bottomlands. Later accounts from a field hand suggested that Gresham had instructed them to bring her back unharmed, as her skills made her a valuable asset he couldn't lose. Jacob Yarrow's cold response indicated that value meant nothing to him. Only total submission mattered. The 5 men entered the woods 15 minutes after her, brimming with confidence that the chase would be brief. They had captured grown men before. A teenage girl seemed like a simple task. Armed with rifles and fueled by decades of unchecked authority, they expected the wilderness to submit to them. They were unaware that Celia had spent her life preparing for this confrontation. She had mapped the water trails, memorized the terrain, and transformed the bottomlands into a part of herself. She wasn't fleeing, she was acting as a guide. Initially, the overseers felt they were winning. They spotted broken branches and footprints in the silt, signs they interpreted as a trail of panic. Jacob pointed these out with a smug grin, certain the girl was exhausting herself. But as the day progressed, the trail became erratic. Footprints overlapped in impossible ways, and clusters of broken twigs appeared to be deliberate decoys, as if she were sculpting the land to mislead them. Samuel argued she was circling in confusion, but Jacob felt a growing unease. These weren't the marks of a lost child. They were the beginnings of a trap. He ignored the knot in his stomach. They camped at twilight on a small rise, their fire barely holding back the immense darkness. The sounds of the swamp, the croaking and the splashing, surrounded them, but nothing showed itself. They took turns on watch, certain she was collapsing from fatigue somewhere nearby. But the morning brought a shock to their confidence. Their food sacks had been opened, not ripped apart by animals, but surgically inspected. Only the most calorie-dense, lightweight items were gone. Tyson, who swore he had stayed awake all night, had heard nothing. The fire was untouched, the moss curtains were still, and the only tracks around the camp belonged to the 5 of them. Samuel blamed the others for being lazy, but the reality was more terrifying. Someone had moved between armed men as they slept, knowing exactly where their supplies were and how to take them without a sound. Jacob forced them deeper into the woods, refusing to admit the fear rising within him. By noon, Celia's trail was blatantly obvious. Fresh symbols were carved into the trees at regular intervals. Jacob couldn't read the creek marks, but his instincts screamed a warning. She was no longer the one being followed. She was the one tracking them. Near the end of the second day, they found the first cache inside a hollow tree. It contained items they hadn't even realized were missing. Rope cut to specific lengths, spent casings from their own rifles they didn't remember firing, and a scrap of cloth from Burke's shirt, even though his clothes looked intact. These weren't random scraps. They were arranged like ritualistic offerings or warnings. Above them, a symbol was carved so deeply that sap still wept from the wood, something ancient and heavy. Tyson and Burke suggested turning back, and even Samuel's bravado dimmed, but Jacob, consumed by a pride that was turning into a desperate madness, refused to retreat. He would not be humiliated by a child. He would not surrender the illusion of control that defined his existence. So, as the forest closed in and their unity began to crumble, the 5 men pushed on, oblivious to the fact that they were walking into a hunting ground they didn't understand. By the 3rd night, their resolve shattered. They built a fire so large it was a beacon, desperate for a pocket of light in the oppressive dark. No one slept. They sat with rifles gripped in shaking hands, staring into the swaying moss. The swamp felt sentient, observing them like a predator watching a wounded animal. Suddenly, Samuel jumped up and fired a shot into the darkness. A thick, unnatural silence followed, as if the swamp itself had stopped breathing. When dawn broke, they found the truth. Embedded in a tree right next to where Samuel's bullet had hit was one of their own knives. It had been thrown from the canopy with incredible precision. She had been above them the entire time. She could have killed him, but she chose to let him live. Jacob looked at the knife and felt his internal world collapse. The blade hadn't been thrown randomly. It was a surgical message. She was proving that their survival was a gift from her, not a result of their weapons. The overseers whispered in terror, their bravado gone. Henry Burke began to mutter that the girl wasn't alone, that the woods themselves were her allies. No one corrected him. They held their rifles like children holding toys, realizing that steel and lead were useless against something this ancient. Still, Jacob pushed them on. His pride had fermented into insanity. Celia's signs became more frequent, and the terrain became deadly. Solid ground turned into sinking mires. Paths looped back on themselves in ways that defied physics. William Tyson fell into a muck pit that nearly buried him. As they pulled him out, his leg was badly injured and began to swell. The tainted swamp water they drank caused his mind to fracture with fever. During their brief rests, their gear would shift. A pack would be moved. A rifle would be leaning against a different tree. They tried to blame exhaustion or each other, but they knew the truth. She was drifting through their camp like mist, touching their things and dismantling their world while they sat paralyzed by the illusion of watchfulness. That night, the swamp changed. The sounds of animals died away, and from the canopy came a haunting, melodic singing. The language was a mix of things, ancient memory and warning. The overseers huddled in a circle, imagining her face in the darkness. When Samuel screamed threats into the trees, the singing would move, from behind him, to his left, then above him. Her laughter followed, echoing as if the forest itself were mocking them. They fired blindly until their ammunition was low, revealing nothing but their own terror in the muzzle flashes. By morning, the men were on the brink of madness. They discovered that their packs had been opened once more. Inside, local flowers, swamp hibiscus and spider lilies, were placed delicately on their belongings. Beneath the flowers were locks of their own hair, cut cleanly while they sat awake. Items were missing, a button from a coat, a strip of a trouser leg. In Jacob's pack sat a drawing of 5 figures. 4 had crosses over their chests. 1 was left alone. It was a choice. Celia was showing them she had already decided who would stay and who would be allowed to go. Even Jacob felt his pride vanish into pure terror. They were no longer the hunters. They were specimens being dissected. Nathaniel Cruz did not survive to see the 4th morning. Before sunrise, his fever claimed him. When the others found him, he was cold and staring at nothing. There was no struggle or wound, just a man consumed by the swamp's indifference and his own fear. Jacob realized they had no way to bury him in the wet earth. They left him with a canteen and a few hollow words, turning away in a betrayal of necessity. The forest seemed to punish them instantly for leaving him. The air grew thick with the smell of rot, and the paths tightened. Tyson's leg became a liability they couldn't carry. When he collapsed into the water, he looked into their eyes and saw their cowardice. He told them to leave, warning that she was watching. They hesitated for a moment of pretense and then let go, leaving him to be swallowed by the mud. Now only Jacob, Samuel, and Henry remained, staggering through a hostile world. Their food was gone and their throats burned. Every tree seemed to bear a new carving, a ledger of their failures. Jacob realized with horror that she had been studying their reactions, testing how much their ignorance could endure before they broke. That afternoon, they stumbled into a quiet clearing with a small pond. On the other side stood Celia. She didn't hide. She watched them with a calm that contained no fear. Her face was painted with clay and ash, and she held a bow made from the forest itself. Behind her, their missing items were laid out like trophies, disassembled rifles, ropes, and knives. For a long time, there was silence. Jacob tried to summon his old authority, raising his broken rifle and demanding she surrender. Celia merely tilted her head and asked what she had to answer for, running from harm or knowing the land better than they knew their own cruelty. Samuel tried to accuse her of murder, but she countered that the swamp had taken them because they believed they were in charge. Jacob pulled the trigger, but the gun only clicked. Celia loosed an arrow that thudded into the ground by his foot, a mercy shot. She told them that one could walk out to tell the story, or all could stay. Henry Burke broke first, sprinting into the brush in a state of total panic. Samuel followed, leaving Jacob alone. Celia told him to go and tell people that the bottomlands would no longer tolerate their kind. Jacob stumbled after his men, his pride replaced by a humiliation so deep it felt like a wound. He didn't look back as her voice drifted through the trees, reminding him that both she and the land remembered. He didn't know if he was heading towards safety, but he knew he had been spared, and that mercy was a heavier burden than any lash. Henry Burke emerged from the woods 36 hours later, crawling on his knees, his skin covered in scratches that looked like fevered writing. He was mentally shattered, babbling about trees that moved and a girl who left no tracks. A search party of 10 men later entered the swamp, but they returned in fear after finding Samuel Yarrow dead in shallow water with no signs of violence. They refused to go deeper, claiming the forest was changing around them and that the symbols on the trees were watching them. After 5 days, they abandoned the search. Would you like me to expand on the aftermath of this event, or perhaps develop a similar story set in a different historical period? No additional threat could compel those men to venture further into the interior. Consequently, Jacob Yarrow's remains were left to the elements for 2 weeks before passing hunters discovered the grisly scene, a decaying form draped in tattered clothes, his cold fingers still clutching a broken pocket watch. William Tyson and Nathaniel Cruz were never recovered. Their bodies were absorbed into the swamp's insatiable hunger, becoming permanent fixtures of an environment that consumes everything too sluggish or too arrogant to respect its boundaries. Henry Burke remained on the Gresham estate for several weeks, his body healing while his sanity drifted further into the shadows. He could not bring himself to look toward the eastern woods, flinching at the cry of a bird or the rustle of wind through the moss. In moments of perceived isolation, he etched symbols into the soil, markings that Creek elders recognized as fragments of narratives far older than the county itself. He eventually fled Georgia for Alabama, where he spent 30 years cautioning anyone who would listen never to pursue a runaway into the deep woods. He maintained that the forest possessed ears, that the earth made its own choices, and he shared the most chilling realization of all. Celia never had to shed blood to triumph. She only needed to master the land more completely than the men who claimed to own it. Celia never set foot in Gresham's fields again. Officially, she was reduced to a mere entry in the runaway archives, a description of height, skin tone, and age, as if ink could bind the magnitude of her actions. Gresham filed his formal report, but when he pleaded with the sheriff to send a posse into the bottomlands, the lawman offered only a grim laugh. He reminded Gresham that 5 seasoned overseers had gone in and 4 had perished, asking if the planter truly believed deputies were any braver. There was no response Gresham could offer that didn't betray his own weakness. The reality was stark. Hunting Celia now meant volunteering to enter a realm that no longer acknowledged white authority. The enslaved community noted her disappearance, and in the shadows they exchanged hushed accounts of her victory. With every whisper, the girl in the story evolved, becoming more of a legend than a person, yet one detail remained unshakable. 5 men pursued her, and only 1 returned with his life. The Gresham plantation began to crumble from within, not through fire or open revolt, but through 1,000 subtle acts of defiance that eroded profit like insects through timber. Tools vanished and reappeared shattered. Bales of cotton consistently weighed less than expected. The quality of the fiber thinned mysteriously before reaching the scales. Fences seemed to fail daily. Every task took just a little longer than necessary, creating a cumulative disaster. Without overseers willing to risk the swamp, Gresham attempted to enforce his own will, but a community that had witnessed the system's humiliation no longer feared him. They worked on their own terms, obeying just slowly enough to ruin his finances. Within 3 years, Gresham was insolvent. He sold the estate to a speculator and headed west, attempting to outrun a failure that clung to him like a shadow. The subsequent owners believed that increased cruelty would restore order. They hired new overseers, men with reputations for violence that eclipsed even the Yarrows. But news traveled through the invisible networks of the enslaved, and many men refused the job once they heard of the girl who broke 5 hunters. Those who did take the position encountered a new spirit on the land, a quiet, immovable stubbornness. Resistance was now part of the atmosphere, passed from person to person like a survival prayer. Over the next decade, the plantation changed hands repeatedly, but no one could extract a true profit from it. While neighboring estates reported typical escape numbers, runaways near the Ojai bottomlands disappeared with startling frequency. Search parties either returned empty-handed or did not return at all. It appeared the land had chosen a side. Rumors spread far beyond the county lines. Some claimed Celia had died and her spirit had merged with the water to guide others to freedom. Others argued she lived for decades in a hidden community deep in the marshes, a sanctuary where the displaced survived, using ancient knowledge. Travelers occasionally spoke of a woman of mixed heritage who appeared to the lost, guiding them to solid ground before vanishing without a word. Historians eventually dismissed these tales as swamp folklore or ghost stories, yet the data remained undeniably real. Escape success rates near the bottomlands were unnaturally high. While official records never confirmed a settlement or Celia's ultimate fate, the absence of documentation is not proof that she wasn't there, especially in a place designed to swallow evidence. We know this much. 5 men entered the Ojai bottomlands in October 1839. 4 were taken by sickness, water, and their own hubris. 1 returned as a broken shell, carrying scars that looked like language and memories that haunted him until his death. The girl they hunted was never caught. The surviving legal fragments quietly admit that the men died because they challenged someone who understood the environment better than they ever could. That understanding, rather than gunpowder, determined the survivors. Celia's story became a lasting lesson, a message whispered through time that the hunted are not always powerless. Sometimes the earth itself refuses to facilitate cruelty, and true power rests with those who understand the world, not those who claim to own it. So, I ask you, what do you believe truly happened in those Georgia woods? Was it a simple matter of superior survival skills, or was it something more profound, a shift in the balance of power that the official records were too terrified to name? Share your theories in the comments. If these accounts of hidden and defiant histories fascinate you, ensure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on. The past still echoes in places like the Bottomlands, and we will continue to listen together.